Welcome back, Focus Learners. Today's explainer is going to completely flip how you think about your 9 to 5 job. We're unpacking a really groundbreaking 1987 lecture that takes a swing at a deeply ingrained societal assumption, which is this idea that wealth and spirituality just have to be totally separated. But, what if they aren't on opposite ends of the spectrum at all? Can maximizing your corporate profits actually be the ultimate path to spiritual enlightenment? I know, it sounds like a total paradox, right? Normally, we picture monks retreating far away from the modern world to find inner peace, while on the flip side, we imagine business executives just relentlessly chasing the bottom line. But today, we're exploring a radical paradigm shift that argues these two worlds aren't just compatible, they're intimately connected. And honestly, depending on both of them might literally be the key to our future. Okay, let's dive into this. The source we're unpacking today is a fascinating 1987 lecture that forms the core of Ryuho Okawa's book, The New Business Revolution. The author presents a really bold thesis here, that religion and economics are absolutely not in conflict. Actually, he argues that the economic world is highly receptive to spiritual truth. He challenges the traditional blind spots of both the religious community and the corporate world, proposing a future where truth and economics are totally seamlessly integrated. It's a wild look at breaking down the walls between what we consider sacred and what we consider secular. So historically, the old paradigm dictated that finding spiritual enlightenment meant ascetic monasticism. Basically, it meant isolating yourself from the state, from commerce, and from everyday worldly desires just to find purity. But this new paradigm completely flips the script. The author proposes that business itself can be a religious practice. Instead of running away from society to find enlightenment, the proposed modern synthesis is all about integration. It's about taking those deep spiritual values and deploying them right out there in the middle of the corporate battlefield. To really understand how we get to this integration, the lecture builds this fascinating historical bridge. Back in the 1st century, early teachings leaned heavily into that asceticism we just talked about. But notice the massive shift in the 16th century with the Protestant Reformation. The text specifically highlights figures like Martin Luther and John Calvin. Calvin's influence was particularly massive, right? Because he introduced the idea that worldly prosperity and financial success could actually represent divine glory. That completely made room for a monetary economy within a religious framework. And that ultimately evolved into modern 20th century capitalism, leading us straight toward the author's predicted future, a systemic total integration of both spheres. The absolute crucial takeaway here is that worldly activities and work themselves can be a path to discovering divine prosperity. The path to enlightenment isn't just limited to some silent monastery on a mountaintop. According to the author, practicing spiritual truth in the real world and maximizing your potential in your specific professional field is just as noble of a practice. Whether you're an engineer, a teacher, or a CEO, doing your job to the absolute best of your ability is, in and of itself, a form of spiritual discipline. Now, what's really interesting about this next concept is how the author forces us to step way outside our own earthly bubble to prove his point. He poses this wild thought experiment. What if human earthly values aren't universal? I mean, it is so easy to assume that what makes someone a successful person on Earth, a huge salary or a fancy corner office, is just some universal cosmic truth. The text introduces a surprising pattern interrupt here to challenge our inherent biases and force us to look at the economy from an entirely different, almost cosmic dimension. So the lecture introduces these fascinating hypothetical extraterrestrial value systems to make its point. Imagine Planet A, where the supreme status belongs to artists and creators, the people who produce beauty. The lowest class? Paper-pushing corporate workers who merely move documents from the left side of the desk to the right without ever creating anything new. But then look at Planet B. There, the ultimate status symbol is life creation. Having 20 or more children makes you the equivalent of a billionaire CEO, while those with only one child are considered the lowest class. The author uses these wild extraterrestrial examples to make a very grounded point about Earth. We absolutely must cultivate tolerance. Embracing diverse perspectives is essential because our current value systems are, at the end of the day, entirely relative. When we bring that tolerance and that expanded perspective back down to the individual level, the workplace completely transforms. The text asserts that the company actually becomes a dojo for spiritual practice. A dojo, a traditional training hall for martial arts, a place of intense discipline, respect, and growth. The author argues that instead of treating work as just a place to drag yourself to earn a paycheck, the corporate environment is meant to be the ultimate training ground for your character. Navigating those messy office dynamics, creating real value, and leading your team with integrity, that is your spiritual workout. Let's see how this builds. Because scaling this up from the individual to a macro level, the lecture makes a really radical systemic proposal. The idea is that we shouldn't just bring religion into business, we should actively bring business into religion. Specifically, free market principles. This means introducing healthy competition among spiritual organizations. Instead of just holding a monopoly based purely on tradition, these groups would have to actively compete to provide higher spiritual joy and deeper enlightenment to the public. The author argues this kind of competition would promote internal purification and literally force institutions to deliver tangible spiritual value, rather than just coasting on historical authority. And this is where the author's ideas move from just philosophical theory to hardcore, radical new economic policies. The lecture argues for a complete, ground-up overhaul of the tax incentive system. Currently, as the text points out, taxes are largely based on gross financial revenue. If you make a certain amount of money, you pay a certain tax rate. It's determined purely by the monetary amount. But the author points out the major flaw here. Under our current system, a company that aggressively pollutes the earth and a company that actively improves public well-being are taxed exactly the same way if their financial revenues match. Make it make sense, right? So the author proposes a brand new incentive model based on spiritual value. Under this totally new paradigm, your tax burden is tied directly to your societal contribution. A high pollution or socially harmful company would face a massive high tax burden. A standard neutral company faces a medium tax. But a high spiritual value company, one that is out there actively contributing to the public's well-being and health, would be rewarded with a significantly low tax burden. It fundamentally rewires capitalism to reward ethics and positive societal impact right alongside those financial profits. To kind of contextualize this shift, the text mentions the historical concept of the 10% tithe, the traditional tax given to religious institutions in places like the Christian world. The author notes that while some countries have historically supported spiritual organizations through political and social norms like that, the real lasting reform for the future has to be led by economic shifts rather than political ones. According to the lecture, political reform is just too slow and fraught with barriers. Whereas the economic world, the realm of business and finance, is actually way more fluid, pragmatic, and ready to embrace this new spiritual economic integration. Which brings us to a massive, really fascinating thought experiment to wrap up today's explainer. If your company was taxed right now based purely on its spiritual contribution, what would you owe? Would you be facing a huge penalty for draining society or a massive rewarding tax break for lifting it up? It's a really powerful way to evaluate not just the companies we work for, but the daily work we put in ourselves inside our own corporate dojos. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer on the intersection of economics and spiritual truth. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you in the next one.